A Welcome in the Valleys by Richard Burton. Richard Burton was a Welshman. He was a celebrated Shakespearean stage actor. He was a famous film star. He was a much publicized bridegroom, having married the most sought-after woman in the world, Elizabeth Taylor, not just once, but twice, to prove it wasn't a fluke. He was a promising rugby player in his youth, and he was an underrated writer. One piece he wrote told the story of his last ever game as a rugby player. He called it A Welcome in the Valleys, and this is an adapted version of that story. It's difficult for me to know where to start with rugby, so I'll begin at the end. The last shall be first, as it is said, so I'll tell you about the last match I ever played in. I had played the game representatively from the age of 10 until those who employed me in my profession, which is that of actor, insisted that I was a bad insurance risk against certain dread teams in dead-end valleys who would have little respect, no respect, or outright disrespect for what I was pleased to call my face. What if I were unfortunate enough to be trapped under a loose maul? Since my face was already internationally known, and since I was paid, perhaps overpaid, vast sums of money for its ravaged presentation, they, the money men, expressed a desire to keep it that way. Apart from wanting to preserve my natural beauty such as it was, it would affect continuity, they said, if my nose were straight on Friday in the medium shot and was bent towards my left ear on Monday in the close-up. Millions of panting fans from Tokyo to Tonmaur would be puzzled, they said. So there is to this day a clause in my contract that forbids me from flying my own plane, skiing, or playing the game of rugby football, the inference being that it would be all right to wrestle with a Bengal tiger 5,000 miles away, but not to play against, shall we say, Pontypool at home. I decided that they had some valid arguments after my last game. It was played against a village whose name is known only to its inhabitants and crippled masochists drooling quietly in kitchen corners, a mining village with all the natural beauty of the valleys of the moon and just as welcoming, with a team composed almost entirely of colliers. I hadn't played for 4 or 5 years, but I was fairly fit, I thought, and the opposition was bottom of the third class and reasonably beatable, except, of course, on their home ground. I should have thought of that. I should have called to mind that this was the kind of match where, towards the end of the game, you kept your bus ticking over near the touchline, in case you won and had to run for your life. It was a mistaken game for me to play. I survived it with nothing broken except my spirit, the attitude of the opposition being summed up in the simple words, "Never mind a bloody ball, where's the bloody actor?" Words easily understood by all. Among other things, I was playing Hamlet at that time at the Old Vic, but for the next few performances I was compelled to play him as if he were Richard III. The punishment I took had been innocently compounded by a paragraph in a book of reminiscences by the great Blethyn Williams, with whom I had played on and off, mostly off, in the RAF. On page 37 of that volume, Mr. Williams is kind enough to suggest that I had distinct possibilities as a player were it not for the lure of tinsel and paint and money and fame and so on. Incidentally, one of the curious phenomena of my library is that when you take out Blethyn's autobiography from the shelves, it automatically opens at the very page mentioned above. Friends have often remarked on this and wondered afresh at the wizardry of the Welsh. It is, in fact, the only notice I have ever kept. Anyway, this little snippet was widely publicized, and by the time I played that last game had entered into the uncertain realms of folk legend and was deeply embedded in the subconscious of the sub-Welshman I submitted myself to that cruel afternoon. They weren't playing with chips on their shoulders. They were simply skeptical about page 37. That last match was played against troglodytes, men burned to the bone by the fury of their work, bow-legged and embittered because they weren't playing for, or hadn't played for, and would never play for Cardiff or Swansea or Neath or Aberavon. Men who smiled seldom, and when they did it was like scalpels, trained to the last ounce by slashing and hacking away neurotically at the frightened coalface for 7.5 hours a day, stalactitic, tree-rooted, carved out of granite by a rough and ready sledgehammer and clinker, against whose hard volumes I was the soft-cover, paperback edition. I discovered many truths that day. I discovered just after the first scrum, for instance, that it was time I ran for the bus and not for their outside half. He had red hair, a blue-white face, and no neck. Standing upright, his hands were loosely on a level with his shins, and when the ball and I arrived exultantly together at his stock-still body, a perfect set-up, you might suppose, and when I realized that I was supine, and he was lazily kicking the ball into touch, I realized that trying to intimidate a fellow like that was like trying to cow a mandrill, and that he had all the graceful willowy give and sapling bend of pre-stressed concrete. And that was only the outside half.